saying this conference is coming at a particularly interesting time in the world, a terrible time for a lot of people. But here in the United States, for the first time in 50 years, maybe there's more discussion of the structural inequities in society. Um, that hasn't happened at a grand scale as in what is happening now with the Black Lives Matter movement. And this is relevant to a whole graffiti thing because, after all, um, it is about, for very different reasons, but in many ways the same reasons, why people don't have a voice, why people don't have access, why they are stuck in a very unequal society and they're marginalized. And for those of us who were documenting graffiti back in the 70s, I think we recognized that here was a kind of uprising. Here was marginalized people with a voice, and that this was very exciting to us. Um, so I'm glad that what is going on now, um, that we can reflect upon that through the lens of this phenomenon, through the lens of the graffiti phenomenon. Um, I know that as it's spread around, I've had a number of conversations with people who took up, they're professionals now, filmmakers, artists. They lived in other countries, and they found their careers through a kind of apprenticeship of being graffiti kids in their cities. And they attribute their inspiration to graffiti in New York, and very often to our books and the films that we did back then. And one thing that they always mention is that in general, in art and cultural activity, they, growing up as children, didn't have anything going on that mirrored them. They were looking at the films The Godfather, they were seeing cultural production by white people, and there was no mirror that they could say, well, I can do that, I can be part of that. And they say that when they saw pictures and films of kids in New York doing their thing, that was the first the light bulb went off in their heads. They're just like me. I can do that. And that was their kind of entry, not only into writing graffiti and b-boying and the whole hip-hop phenomenon, but after that, they became creative artists of one kind or another. I know several filmmakers who got their start as kids in the neighborhood. So this is not one whole thesis I'm going to expound on for the whole time, but just as a starter,
Yeah.
maybe somebody could comment.
Yeah. I think there are several persons here that they are now researchers or professors that had that experience. Uh, they saw the books and the movies, and they got influenced, and they saw this capacity for
Yeah.
also producing that kind of culture. But somehow also, at least in Europe, when it was exported,
Yeah.
um, some different things happened, and 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 you with spray can art, actually you went into trying to get other images from other places, not
Yes.
only in the
That was
US.
the idea. That was the idea. It was inspired by hearing that there were people in other places that were taking up New York style graffiti writing in their cities. And both Jim and I think I started getting letters from people and Jim had been urging me to do a wall book with him anyway already. And I was like, yeah, maybe. And it wasn't until I began to get letters and see people send pictures and things like that, and to tell me how they were inspired, that I came back and said, "Hey Jim, remember that that idea you had? Let's do it."
Did you
Henry,
yeah.
you're always great wisdom, but you really touched upon something I think very, very important. I've been sequestered here with the virus at home, haven't been out, but I made a couple of forays. I went to San Francisco, I went to Oakland, and I went to Sacramento. And what's fascinating about the outpouring of whatever you want to call it, graffiti, art, in Oakland, in the Fruitvale BART station area, 100 different images were placed on the walls by, call them piecers, call them graffiti, call them artists, the whole ball of wax. 100 Black Lives Matter interpretations. I went to downtown Oakland, and by the way, I never got out of the car. I shot from the car. I think I got out twice. And again, the same thing in Oakland, San Francisco. So it is an extraordinary moment in the history of political art and wall art, and it's worldwide. I'm getting photographs from every part of the world about George Floyd, about I Can't Breathe, Black Lives Matter. I think one of the most significant moments in art history. For whatever title you want to give it, there were spray can artists there, there were brush artists there, there were people who were doing stencils, every aspect that you can think of.
Yeah, expression. Now, did you see there was an article that David Gonzalez did in the New York Times just this past week
No.
about seeing new tags and pieces and throw-ups.
Uh-huh.
It's entitled "It's Back" or something like that.
I'll look for it.
Yeah, it's a good article, and he took some pictures too, going around he went all around New York, taking pictures, and there's some pieces. It looks like a lot of people I don't recognize. You know, they're young, they're starting out. It's like during the lockdown when the streets were empty, I think a lot of kids went out and did some mischief.
Did you see the Fifth Avenue block in front of Trump Tower with the Black
Yes.
Lives Matter?
Yes.
I thought that was wonderful. Also in Washington, also in LA,
Yeah.
Minneapolis. It's just extraordinary.
Yeah.
Absolutely extraordinary.
Talking about the controversy about terminology and intent, I can't tell you how many conversations I've had with writers about how what they are doing is not political.
Yeah.
And so I echo Jim's remark about how extraordinary this moment is, because I think everybody realizes probably now that what they're doing for Black Lives Matter is in fact political.
Yeah. Yep. And it's a voice.
Henry, can you tell me what was the journal, the
It's the New York Times.
New York Times? Okay, so I can search correctly.
It's just like 3 days ago.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
What's also very interesting is that the Trump campaign is now putting out the notion that Black Lives Matter is really a Marxist organization looking to take over the control of the United States. Try that one for size.
That's what is this thing? LOL? That's my response to that. That's hysterical and funny.
Well, I read the articles that are being sent to me
Yeah, I saw
that,
that.
that this is a Marxist plot.
Yep.
Can you imagine?
But that's a danger also. as we have the danger of the, you know, the spiral of the art, we have also the danger of the spiral of the politics.
Yes.
From what I see, it actually it is detached from politics in the sense of regulated politics in these kind of parties and, you know, left, right, and but in a certain sense, it's always captured by these dynamics. Do you have a comment on this? This kind of
Well, I think there's the politics of the art gallery. The politics of the art world is one area of that, um, quite separate from the politics of, you know, political, social, traditional politics. I know that when this in the late 70s and early 80s, there was a lot of anti-nuclear um, protest going on, and the Revolutionary Communist Party, which was very clandestine at that time in the U.S., was organizing things, organizing demonstrations, and organizing cultural events quite apart from their politics. And they approached me to participate. And I had personal friends amongst them, and so I was happy to participate in the protest movements. And they were interested in getting to know graffiti writers and breakdancers, and I think as a recruitment. But they were not successful that way. They you know, none of the young writers that they approached really was interested in Marxism at the time. They were kids, high school kids. They probably hadn't been educated in American schools about, you know, the real history of Marxism and the political ramifications of that. So they were like, you know, equal society and no money. They were not into that at all. I think they most of them had the idea that, well, I'm going to make it, and it was a very individual, I'm going to be successful somehow. That they were not interested in communism at the time.
Henry, I had such a similar experience. One of my problems with documenting graffiti art over all the years was that for the most part it was political by doing what they were doing, yeah. But yeah. It wasn't political in terms of statements. And people like Mir, I really liked because they were very politically oriented, but yeah. The culture was not. And it was disappointing to me because they were occupying a lot of public space, getting attention, but they really didn't have an education as to what the real facts were in terms of the capitalist system and Marxism and all of the different socialism, etc. They were having fun. They were having times out on the at night to be together, and politics were really the last thing, other than that the art itself was political just by painting on the walls in non-permission areas.
One rather big exception to that rule. Well, actually, I know two people. One was Phase 2, of course, who brought out IGT, which was a very political yep. journal in terms of New York politics. I don't think it went beyond there. And of course, the other one who did something similar in Chicago was Billy Wimsatt. His name, now his graffiti name, I forget. But he was a kid who grew up in Chicago. He was a child of academics, and so they lived in Chicago City. And so he began to hang out with other children of color who were breakdancing and writing graffiti, and he took that up himself. And he has turned that experience as a child. He wrote he brought out a journal similar to what Phase Two had done in New York. It was very political, and it was very, you know, a news journal about obviously hip hop and graffiti issues, but also it went beyond that with you know, some real political criticism of society. And he, subsequent to that, he wrote a book called Bomb the System.
On the suburbs.
Yeah, Bomb the Suburbs. You're right. Bomb the Suburbs. And in the course of researching that book, he had traveled around. He hitchhiked all around the country, finding people in various parts of the country who were involved in hip hop. And I think subsequent to that book, he used that experience to start to organize, to find. He had an idea to fund grassroots organizations in out of the way places that were under the radar for funding, and he was going to start a funding organization that would fund them. And so he had this vast network of people all around the country from his hip hop connections, and that's how he began to do his political work. And that has been transformed into, I mean, they did a lot of work getting out the vote in 2008, and more recently, they tried, they failed to help to turn the thing around, but they're very active now. It's called, I think it's called, I'll look it up, but it's Voter Movement or something like that. It's called Movement to Vote, I think. I can put that on a link. It's a very interesting organization, and it has this heritage of going back to this kid who was political and involved with graffiti and hip hop back in the day.
Henry, that's so interesting. I lived in Chicago, and Billy came to one of my very first slideshows, and I would say that I'm a small piece of his political puzzle.
Yeah. I bet you are. That's great.
I stayed in touch with him.
Yeah.
I think he ended up in Washington, and then I lost touch with him. But absolutely, that was a great example of combining the art form with the politics.
Yeah.
One of the more interesting things for me in his writing was that I believe it was Bomb the Suburbs. He also wrote No More Prisons.
Right.
Was that he set out to hitchhike through the Americas and visit every single project and neighborhood that was was famous for being the most dangerous place that you could go. And he's a white kid, and these were mostly black places. And so he would go visit, and then he would report back in his travel diary. This book became this book about how he could walk through there. People would talk with him. The children were friendly. Nobody attacked him. That the most reaction that he got was more of surprise than anything else. Like, here's this white guy in our neighborhood, that never happens. But I thought that was a very interesting thing for him to do. And I think it was healing in a lot of ways between the black and the white cultures or perceptions of each other.
Yeah.
Certainly, I think that helped the white people.
Can we move to a different subject? Are there other questions that people would like to ask?
It's open. If someone wants to add other subject to the
Don't be bashful.
Yeah.
I like the portrait behind you, Jim.
This portrait is done by Brett Cook. It took him 10 years to paint it. I wish it was better focus. It's all done with a spray can, believe it or not. It's absolutely wonderful.
But he uses a kind of pointillistic technique, doesn't he?
Absolutely.
Like built up of tiny little squirts.
What he does is the very first thing is down below in the corner there, He does a black and white with little lines, and then he projects it up onto the wall and then uses the spray can to paint it. He's painted hundreds of these. He's very well known, Brett Cook, Disney from Berkeley. And by the way, up on the other side is maybe the best canvas that Blade ever painted. And long-term good friend Blade actually gave that to me as a present. But it's a marvelous, marvelous piece. And on the other side of my head is Freedom's very famous jacket with the spray can coming out that's in the tunnel near 105th Street, near where you used to live, Henry.
Yeah, yeah. Under Riverside Park.
Yeah, exactly. Well, while you're thinking, Heidi's coming in, we're going to go swimming. You're on television worldwide, Heidi. I went to Sweden in 1992, I think it was, with Africa Bambaataa. We were invited to by Jakob Kimball, which was very nice. And I always found that when I finished my presentations, it was very quiet. People were afraid to kind of be the first to break the ice. And so when Africa finished and he said, "Are there any questions?" there was silence. And I said to myself, well, that's very rewarding. If they can't ask Africa questions, then I won't feel so bad. Anyhow, somebody's got to have a question for Henry or for Susan.
Or for Jim. Yeah. So
it's been an incredible conference. I must commend all of you for your wisdom and for your energy in really researching this subject and continuing the dialogue. It is a remarkable thing for us who've been there for so many years to have seen these just, you know, what you want to call calligraphy, T-Kid 170 on a sidewalk, and to know, you know, where these people are today, the recognition that they've gotten against all odds, for sure, against all odds. So you're into a culture that I think is very exciting, and where it will go, I don't know for sure, but you can be sure it's going to keep on evolving into many different areas.
I have here Svenska voice.
Well, I was thinking about, well, first of all, I'm starstruck and Swedish, so that's why I'm quiet for a change. But I have like a million questions to these guys. But I was thinking about what Henry said earlier about the G word, the fact that some writers don't appreciate that word being used, but I'm guessing that's because how media used it in a derogatory way in the U.S. But when hip hop and graffiti came to Europe, it was that word graffiti was charged with positive connotations. But I don't really have a question attached to it, but I would just love to hear more about like your early travels over to Europe and your impressions of seeing kids pick that whole thing up over here, and Sweden in particular.
Yeah. But the G word, I had something else to say about the G word. But anyway, it'll come floating back. I think the first time I went to Europe after doing this project, and when Subway Art was about to come out, I think it was 1984, we were invited to Barcelona but there's an American Cultural Center there, and they brought me and Lee Quinones and a couple of other people from the U.S. for a conference and to show slides and to talk. I remember going to the Plaza de Catalunya there and being absolutely blown away by what was going on. There were hundreds, I don't know how many crews, but people, hundreds of kids breaking up into crews all around in the underground of the plaza, in the train station, breaking. And their boom boxes, making a lot of noise, and their ciphers, and they were all breaking there. And
Awesome.
I was just amazed. And it was 1984, and I got taken around to spots, but I never got taken to a spot where there was graffiti, and I'm sure there was some there in 1984. I would be really surprised if there wasn't. And it wasn't until Jim and I were working on the book, which was 2 years later, that I ended up going there again and found some pieces and found some writers.
Nice.
That was really my first experience, was that amazing, not even an event, just any old day. You'd walk down into the subway station at the Plaza de Catalunya, and it was
Yeah.
hundreds of B-boys.
Wow. Appreciate it.
I'd
Yeah.
like to,
Yes. Go ahead,
I'm
please.
sorry.
ahead.
About the G word. So I believe that the biggest detractor of the G word was Phase 2,
Yeah.
and he was adamant that it should be called style writing.
Uh-huh.
And part of his thrust for this nomenclature, I believe, was that he strongly believed that it was important for it to be distinct from scribbling, which was the root of the graffiti word. And he also, I believe, being a black man, wanted to own the term, have the culture own its own terms, rather, not himself, but he wanted it. He wanted the graffiti writers to make their own words for their own things.
Yeah.
And he didn't want to accept the outer culture, the predominant culture's terms for what they were doing. And we saw a lot of that rejection of the word tag for the same reason.
Uh-huh.
Tag was more of a media term than a description than it was what people were describing their own activity as. And so I think that makes a lot of sense to me, even though I use the G word a lot. I'm careful to also talk about writing and also talk about style and also try to use the terms that people use themselves, because I also believe that culture should own their own terms.
True. Well, Phase 2, as a black man, referred to that it was same as a slave name.
Right. I believe
Black
that was
people
what
in
he used.
America have the names of the masters until they change their names, and that's what he was also referring to. Graffiti had been named by the the occupying culture, basically.
An interesting thing happened when I started taking photos of graffiti. I started in 1986, and I got a camera in the early 90s of my own, so I really started to ramp up then. And just before I started the website, I was wandering around the world with my pocket photo book with pictures from Atlanta and pictures from Prague. And I would show them to anybody who would hold still long enough to look at them because I was so excited about the work. Yeah. And almost to a person, the people I showed this to said, "Oh, that's not graffiti."
Uh-huh.
And so I thought, wow, that's really interesting, right? People don't want to accept this cultural practice. They want to separate it into aesthetics only. So aesthetically, they decided this was art and it couldn't possibly be graffiti. And that graffiti was that thing that everybody hates that shows up on the light pole or whatever in marker.
The inside.
And so, yeah. And so I thought, wow, there's something really interesting about this kind of rejection, inclusion, and terminology that non-graffiti writers were trying to impose so that they could have a framework to appreciate it.
Yeah.
And I thought and that was why I called my website Art Crimes, because I really wanted people to have to go look at that to see what it was about.
Yeah.
And to have to confront the fact that these graffiti writers were creating something that a lot of people would have to admit was actually interesting artwork.
Yeah.
But
I
I feel
wanted
like
to-
I was kind of at the heart of that terminology discussion argument for a very long time because of that.
I just wanted to make the point that it was so foreign to us. Like graffiti was charged with such positive and cool meanings in Scandinavia, at least. So it took me a while to understand where he was coming from. But I
I think
respect
that,
I respect
yeah,
his stance. too.
the big difference between, in my view, of between the American context and the European context of graffiti is that by the time graffiti writing showed up in Europe, it had already been married to hip hop. Whereas in the US, and that was because of the films.
Yeah.
That in the US, graffiti arose before hip hop, long before hip hop.
It took
in
us a while
several
to figure that out.
Yes, and so there was not this conflation of hip hop and graffiti at first, and also there in the U.S. the ethnic struggles and the cultural bias and prejudice against non-white people created another kind of thing that wasn't really going on in Europe so much, where white people in the US could pretend that it was these people we don't like on the other side of the city who are doing this, because graffiti was an act that was done by invisible people.
Yeah.
So you could just imagine who those invisible people were, and then you could attach all that prejudice to them. And that's also why there was so much so many people getting killed and arrested for doing graffiti here. That's why there was so much eradication. There were no halls of fame. There was no community pride in the output of the youth because of the racial tensions here. So that's why I think it's so difficult for Europeans to understand the this mess that we had in the US about that. And it's also difficult for Americans to understand the harmony of hip hop and graffiti and community spaces that much of Europe enjoys.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
But when Style Wars came out, it became quite evident that there were a lot of white dudes in Led Zeppelin T-shirts writing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did that cause a fuzz that you that you disclosed that secret, so to speak, among writers
Among writers, a fuss among writers? I don't think so. I think
or the establishment, or I mean the average Joe? Like, were they? Do you remember people being surprised?
they were surprised. They were definitely surprised because, as Susan says, people assumed that it was just, Black and Latino kids. And forgetting or not knowing that, some of the original people in Washington Heights who started writing were actually, Taki, famous Taki, is of Greek descent.
Sure.
And, and Blade's crew, Blade was the only African American in the crew. Everyone else was white in the original TC5.
Right.
There was also a lot of gang violence here, and a lot of the gangs were non-white groups, and so and those gangs had a graffiti tradition of their own, which is separate from the style writing tradition, and maybe not so separate now. But that the news media seized on this gang association with graffiti, and that allowed the police to be very, very brutal,
Right.
and allowed an escalation of punishment and laws here that would not have been possible had it not been associated with gun carrying, dangerous, murdering, drug fiend, organized crime kind of things that the gangs have been saddled with.
Appreciate it. I'm gonna let someone else speak.
Yes, let me comment quickly. If you want to really get some very good insight. We recently made a film called Who is Taki 183? It's about 20 odd minutes long. It's available for free. I suggest that you take a look at it. Very good insight from one of the very famous and early writers. That's number one. Number two, Pedro, you're welcome to send out my email, and I'm sure Henry and Susan's to all of the members who are watching. And you're welcome to send questions you may think of later or in the future. I personally am very, very honored and pleased to be part of this whole get together. And so I would be open to certainly try to answer any questions that you might have in the future.
Yeah, you can use the chat as you want. You are free to put your emails and links as you wish. Like for instance, the link for the video of Taki and that stuff. There's a question from one more person, one more researcher. It's Hilaria Hope.
Thanks.
Yeah.
So, hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Very well.
Yeah. Wonderful. Yeah. Finally, it's all me. I want to say hi to everybody. I miss everybody. I miss Lisbon. But yeah, my question is a little bit around the issue that you were talking about in these last minutes. So in a way, maybe it's already answered. I was wondering always a little bit if, as witnessed the early times in the 70s in New York, graffiti became involved in a racist discourse, like saying graffiti was, something that we don't want to have around the city, and that is always from Black people. I had this impression, but there was, as you already mentioned, I think this kind of conflations, because as you said, Taki, he was had this Greek roots, and then also in Style Wars, there is this white guy saying, yeah, the police, they were always chasing the black guys, and so we white guys could just do what we wanted to do and take and bomb the city as we like to do, because this was a kind of racial profiling. So I always wondered that maybe in the 70s, graffiti became really like something that were only from, Black neighborhoods. And that was also the reason why it became so, such a, dangerous and bad thing, like a really negative and racist discourse around graffiti. And my second question and last question is a little bit, I'm always fascinated, I have to say, from this background of the films where you see the Bronx completely, bombed, like after a war, and what was going on with the market there on the immobile, real estate speculation. Because in a way, these neighborhoods, they stayed poor. I mean, there weren't any gentrification going on or something like that. So I never really understand what was going on there with these neighborhoods and with this kind of completely broken architecture.
There's a film that I guess you should see about the burning of the Bronx, which has come out this past year. And of course, I can't remember the name of it. Decade of Fire, got it.
Okay.
Worth seeing, because it's a chronicle of those years. Clearly, there was something going on. I spoke to a priest who was the liaison of the Catholic Church with all the dioceses of the Catholic Church in the Bronx, with the city, with the borough president. And he told me an anecdote that he had a meeting with the borough president in the late 70s when the Bronx was burning, and he remembers going and saying to the borough president, Now, sir, about these fires, like, and the actually had the chutzpah, the Bronx Borough president, to say, raise his eyebrows in shock and say, fires? Fires? What are you talking about? I mean, there was clearly some kind of, whether it was uh, completely acknowledged or not, but there was a relationship between the city and the real estate interests, and the Robert Moses had already done a fatal blow to the South Bronx by driving the Cross Bronx Expressway through,
Mhm.
causing, ruining basically a viable neighborhood. Um, that they thought that, well, what are we going to do now? Let's let it just burn down, and we, the real estate industry, will redevelop it. It'll be a big boondoggle. Um, and it happened. It didn't happen exactly the way I think they thought it would, where they'd be building, industrial parks and a brand new city right there because it was very conveniently close to Manhattan. But eventually, this is what actually unfolded. I think it's a combination of neglect. I mean, after all, the federal government was neglecting the cities at that time, the northeastern cities, the Rust Belt. There was something called the Club of Rome, which said the best thing to do with them is let them go to hell and redevelop the South and the Southwest of the country. And that's what the federal government, where the funds were allocated. And that in connection with the interstate system, which of roads, which, meant everybody was going out to the suburbs and into parts of the country that hadn't been developed. So there is a lot to what you're saying there
Mm.
in terms of real estate. I was interviewing uh, Marshall Berman, who was a City College professor of sociology, who wrote a wonderful book called "All That Is Solid Melts into Air," which was a Marxist quote. And he had grown up in the South Bronx, and I went with him to his old neighborhood, which was ruined like a bombed out city by then, and interviewed him. And would you know that while we were standing there interviewing him, his car drove up, and these two young guys got out, young white men, got out of the car, and they said, "So what are you doing?" And I said, "Well, we're making a documentary, and we're interviewing this man about this neighborhood." And he said, "Yeah." I said, "What are you doing?" He said, "We're actually looking for property to buy."
Mhm.
So
Okay,
I would like to
thank
talk
you.
about
Yeah,
speak to your first question.
yeah.
So I did a lot of talking to people about racial makeup of crews because I was very curious along the lines that your question goes. Everything I knew about graffiti was wrong because the news reported something that wasn't true, and so I had to do a lot of talking to people to find out what was going on. When I started talking to writers in Los Angeles about race and crews, I was told that there were only a few all Black crews in the city, and there were some all Latino crews, but most were multicultural.
Mhm.
And I was also told that there were some white supremacist crews in Chicago, and that everybody knew who those people were, but that was a rare exception. But in Los Angeles, they said, look around you. The Black community doesn't have money. We can't afford spray paint. And so that's why most of the writing there was being done by suburban kids because they had the resources, they had the time, and they were also probably not going to ruin their lives if they got arrested, which was another big consideration for the minority groups. So Black kids in Los Angeles absolutely could not afford to get arrested because they might never be able to advance in economically in life if that happened to them. And they were acutely aware of that. They were much closer to survival conditions than the white kids were for the most part.
yeah, in New York, um, to answer that part of the question too. My own mind had to be changed because I too had with me the idea that it was Black and Latino kids, and I was quite surprised that when I started to get to know writers, that there were lots and lots of white kids involved, and in fact that it basically reflected the New York City demographic of populations. Everybody was doing it.
Mhm.
I think, and there was a lot of harmony. There was some difficult beef between the different crews, but there were crews that were made up of in a multicultural way. And I would say that one of the ways that took place was in school cafeterias, in the rare exceptions that they're integrated schools in New York. And one of the integrated schools was the High School of Art and Design. And the writers from all over the city met there because they were gifted artists who were selected to go to this school, and they met other graffiti writers there, and actually formed new crews, and new expeditions took place from the exposure to each other, and it was quite an integrated and multicultural scene coming out of schools like that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
We have here an active author on that period. John Fechner is
John.
around. Yeah. Do you want to say some words, John?
Okay.
Because John, you produced some works on this time, correct?
It's great to hear from Henry, obviously, to hear the complete story. Hey, Henry.
Hi, John. Good to see you.
Good. I like to bring it back to everyone, number one, to be safe wherever you are. Being in New York and Queens and Bronx and Staten Island and Brooklyn and Manhattan, everybody's having a difficult time and slowly coming out of this period. It's great to hear this international conversation that includes a lot of history, and I appreciate hearing it, and I was listening to a lot of it. Everybody's with me?
Yeah.
Yes, John. Thank you. Thank you for the kind.
Hold on.
John, very much on the scene back then when the South Bronx was burning. There was a connection between artists from uptown and the marginal neighborhoods and downtown, where the art scene, New York art scene, was. Can you talk a little bit about that, John?
Of course.
What you did there?
Well, obviously, getting to the Bronx was a big story in terms of the visual aspects of my work. But I was doing work in Queens. I don't want to really go into my history, but I started on the bridges and doing things in Brooklyn and Queens and Williamsburg Bridge and the 59th Street Bridge, now the Ed Koch Bridge. And, I put a few pieces up with a rather small group of diverse people from my neighborhood, which was Jackson Heights, where I lived for 30 years. And Jackson Heights was a pivotal point of everyone coming from different countries and winding up in Elmhurst and Corona and Jackson Heights, Woodside, Sunnyside. As a native New Yorker, that was my kind of home base. I was in Sunnyside, New York. That's where my first gang started when I was 8 years old. But that's not the important thing. The important thing I would like to really state is about where some of the graffiti artists started. And I was part of those original graffiti artists that were showing in Soho as part of the United Graffiti Artists and the UGA. That's Phase 2. That's Richard Admiral, Obama. I wound up doing work with Obama like 10 years later with music. And I just want to just bring that whole big story. It's too big of a story, but I would really want to point out a couple of things, and I'll just put it in a text message of where I can perceive where things came from. I was, what would you call, a delivery boy. I was a mailman traveling the subways from 1968 to 1970. I got arrested with my fellow black worker for jumping over a turnstile in 1968 or 69. You know, we took a chance, we got arrested. You know, there was a lot of things that point to what happened and how I became who I am being on the street. But I would just want to say to anybody very interested in graffiti history, there's two, to me, cultural points that are real important. Is the West Side Story movie from 1961, where there's a lot of work on the backgrounds of walls in New York City. You know, we're not saying that New York City started everything, but if you look to that movie, West Side Story, and if you also look to Up the Down Staircase, which was filmed in Harlem in 1966, there's a lot of graffiti in that movie, a lot of tagging with names that I don't know who they were. And you know, that's kind of big when you talk about two movies that deal with everybody. And it's not just blacks, it's Latinos. And that kind of infused a lot of spirit of younger people. As a white person, I'm just telling you that this is part of kind of the history that infused the spirit of what eventually, you know, just grew to such extraordinary proportions through Taki and all the other artists, Cornbread, and people were watching culture. They saw these movies. So I think it's important to just note in terms of those two movies, I had a lot of influence on people. Did they have a lot of influence on me? Not really, but they were basically looking at the cultural atmosphere of New York City at those times. The late 50s, West Side Story, and Up the Down Staircase. There's graffiti in that movie. Check it out. That's all I really wanted to say. And it's great to hear everyone's input from around the world to really put a lot of stuff in perspective. It's really hard to say what's the best work or who are the people who really, there's just so much to talk about that I just can't say it, but I wanted to point out those two particular points.
Thank you so much for being there.
Thank you, and thank you all, and for all your input and anybody who contacts me. It's always great to hear from you. Thank you.
Welcome. So we have more questions. I know that Svenska wants to make more questions. Maybe you can go ahead. No one steps in. Svenska, come on.
Thanks, John. I want to add that it's particular that graffiti did not catch on by West Side Story or the Warriors here in Sweden, but gangs did get established after those films were aired on the big screen. But I wanted to ask a bit about the book Spray Can Art, and I'm sure you get this all of the time, but it's a really important book to me, and I've just been doing workshops with kids 12 to 15, and I made sure that they got a copy of it and they started biting it straight off, just like I did. But I've always wondered how you went about choosing what material to include in that book. Like, for instance, why is Sweden not in that book? There are tales of that there were thoughts of featuring Swedes, and I know that for example Circle and Weird from Stockholm were at Henry's studio I think while it was being made. Or if you could elaborate on that, and Renee Westhoff coming over, did he contribute with like photos from, where was it? Australia? The Netherlands? Like, how did you pick what countries to feature? Sorry for the long
Okay,
one.
very quick. We started with 2,000 photographs. Painful, we got down to 1,000. Then we got down to 600. And I said to Henry, I can't go any further. Every one of these belong in the book. Let them decide. They only wanted 225. Henry said to me, you're crazy. They haven't got the judgment and we've got to do it. So we did it. Very interesting sidelight. We had 2 pages with probably the best 2 pages that would have been in the book. And our editor said, you're 2 pages too much, and took them out. And who were on those 2 pages? Not necessarily what you would call graffiti artists, but just people like Keith Haring, Richard Hambleton, Nagley, and Prey. We were very prescient about putting them in there, and they weren't included. So that's our story. It's a very painful process. The Vienna ones we should have dropped out. Henry was very wise. They were very modest. I just like the idea of a different country, and we should have kept the centerfold with Haring and in those days, 1987, Nagley, Hambleton, not well known. Hambleton's canvases, by the way, are now bringing 200, 300,000 bucks just for the shadow figures. One last thought. In terms of the title, the publisher says they know how to merchandise the best. They reserve the right. I wanted to call the book, and I think this is very pertinent to our discussion, and that is I wanted to call it graffiti art, but it was not appropriate, they said. So then I wanted to call it aerosol art, but they said nobody's going to know what aerosol is. And they came up with the right title, which is spray can art. And so I think that Henry and I did name the art form, and that's what it is. It's spray can art. And that's the story of how we got down to 225 photos.
I appreciate the effort. It came out all right, and I'm looking forward to part 2 of Spray Can Art.
Aha. Let me add to that, because I think, while Jim, that story is true, it's also true that we got mail, we got sent things, we met people, so in a way, our selection was based on people that we knew. I mean, I lived in Italy for 2 years in the 60s. Why is there nothing from Italy there? Because nobody told me. I hadn't gone back. Nobody told me there was anything going on. I didn't get mail from there. We got mail from France and the Netherlands and from the UK. Jim got something from Yerevan, from Armenia. I don't know if we even put that in the book. Did we, Jim?
There's one from Russia in there.
Yeah, that's the Yerevan.
In the front of the book, yes.
Yeah,
Not that we took, but was sent to us.
sent to us. For the
Yeah,
most part,
almost all the pictures in the book are Henry's and mine, but there are credits for people who shared with us because we couldn't just be everywhere.
right. New Zealand, for instance. I think
Exactly.
Australia, we included
Yeah.
somebody else's work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'd like to address a different topic briefly, if
Fine.
that's okay. So there's one of the focuses of this conference and the journal associated with it is the confluence of user experience and graffiti and urban art generally, I suppose. So one of the first times I really thought about that was prior to my entry, I guess, into the profession of user experience. It was before it was even called user experience. I was doing some UI design at the time. So there was activity, but it wasn't identified as user experience. However, I was taking pictures of graffiti all over the place, and in Atlanta in particular, where I was going to college. And when I started, when I finally connected with the writing community there and started going on photo safaris with writers, we would go to some of those cuddy places that someone mentioned earlier, I think, where you had to be escorted into these secret places that you would never encounter otherwise, because they're 2 or 3 steps out of view, or you had to climb down into the culvert, or they were way under the bridge, or it was a really scary kind of place. It didn't look like there was any place there. And so we would go into these kind of places, and there would be some really cool artworks on the walls, often under bridges or in culverts of some kind underground. And I asked people why it was they painted there, because I had the impression at first that graffiti art was a public expression and that it needed that public exposure in order to be effective. And here are these pieces that maybe only a few people would ever see, and maybe nobody would see some of these. And one group of writers that I was with said, oh, we come here all the time, and we paint here partly because we can spend all day here and no one will bother us, but also because homeless people live here and they deserve to have something nice in their environment. We're decorating it for them and they really appreciate that. And I thought, wow, nobody had ever told me anything that they were doing nice for homeless people before, or that they even considered homeless people people, really, right? So there's a tendency in the US to ignore homeless people as much as you possibly can, right? And then there are do-gooders who try to feed people and try to get them various kinds of help, but there weren't people doing aesthetic things for them except for these graffiti writers, and they were characterizing these spaces as the homeless people's living rooms. And I thought that was very compelling. And then I began to try to understand how muralism was at work in various communities in the US. So we had Philadelphia, which had a lot of murals going on, and it turned out that a lot of those were done by an art group that was part of the jail diversion program for graffiti artists who had been arrested. So you could some of them were allowed to do community service of a sort by joining this particular group and then painting murals for a specified period of time in order to make it up to society that they had gotten arrested writing on something without permission. So, and the thing that was really interesting about that to me was that mural organization forbid the use of spray can. So they associated the tool with the culture that they wanted to squash, and then they forced the graffiti writers to use brushes. And the writers were often very upset about this because they had all these skills that they had developed for years and years and years, and they were very proud of with paint. And now they were forced to use this thing that they couldn't express themselves as well with, and it felt very, very punitive. And yet, as user experience of the murals in Philly and also in San Francisco was that neighborhoods were so brightened up by these that people perceived them, the neighborhoods, as being safer once they had a mural in them. And the communities themselves, the members of the community felt pride in these murals, no matter how the murals were produced. They felt like these are ours. And we saw that also when Venice Beach in Los Angeles was buffed and torn down, uh, which happened over several episodes. But each time the Venice Beach said, no, those are ours. This is part of our neighborhood identity. And they didn't feel like that about that at first, but over time that became such a tourist draw. It was such a part of the aesthetics of everything anybody did on the beach, that they just couldn't imagine not having that. And they felt terrorized by the police and the buffers and the city coming out there and taking away this identity. And another thing that struck me as kind of the juxtaposition of user experience and graffiti was, I got email one day from a freight worker, freight train worker, and he said, I just had to write to you and let you know that a lot of us really enjoy seeing graffiti on freight trains. Well, this is the most exciting thing that ever happens during our workday. And we're very interested in seeing what the next train brings because it's always new and always fresh. We're out here in the middle of nowhere. We got nothing to do except look at these trains, and it's really awesome. And I said, wow, this is really cool. I never really expected that, but I often was curious about that. And I said, you know, one of my burning questions for you is, what about those holy rollers? I don't know if you know what those are, but they're really tall freight trains that carry cars. So there'll be 3 or 4 layers of stacks of automobiles inside the train car. And the outside of the train car is metal that has little holes in it, so you can see through it. And writers really like to paint those because the paint sticks to them so nicely, and it's and they're really, really, really big. And so, everyone was worried who was painting these that they were somehow ruining the cars inside, the automobiles. And so I asked this freight worker, and I said, you know, are people actually destroying cars when they paint those holy rollers? And he said, no. That there was just a little bit of dust overspray. It came off really easily and no one should worry about that. And I thought, wow, that's really cool. But anyway, I think the invisible audiences a lot of times are experiencing this work in ways that really improves their lives. And it wasn't until the internet, I believe, when the audiences and the writers were able to have conversations with each other finally, and writers were able to understand the impact of their work on other people because of that necessary clandestine nature of creating the work. Another experience I had, and I'll stop in a second, but what was my first trip to Switzerland. In 1994, I was invited there to show art crimes on a computer kiosk in a museum for a month because they didn't have enough bandwidth to pull the content over the web and it was super expensive if they had even tried to do that. So they wanted the website on a CD so they could put it on a computer in the museum. So that's why I was there. And as part of the exhibition, writers were given some walls to paint in Baden. I think Baden is his name. And so we spent all day hanging out in the sun, watching people paint, and we were on a very busy footpath for the locals, and they would come by and say things or come by and not say things. And I would talk to them because I was the person not painting. And people were absolutely delighted to see this artwork. They were so excited. They went away and brought children back. They stayed for a long time. They were just grinning ear to ear. And they were so excited to see who was doing the work because they had seen the writing before, but they had never seen anyone doing it. They were really interested to see how it was done. And they were very, very grateful for that experience. So I think that getting together of the audience and writers makes that user experience visible.
Thank you so much for these moments, Susan. Yeah, it's yeah. Thank you so much. It's very revealing of trajectory that you only know because you were actually the person who better know how to join these two worlds of the graffiti and the internet because you have a big experience in both. So thank you for this sharing. I don't know if someone has specific comments and adding to Susan or to the rest of the panel and to continue the dialogue. I don't have any specific question at this point, but I can find. I just want to open the dialogue. So. I can see two John Fechner's here. It's not just one, it's two. I will remove one, okay, John? Are you there? No, there are two and I will remove one. Okay. So I was very curious always for this relation because actually you worked later on and your
accused.
Sorry, there's someone here. You worked for a long period of time in one of the most prestigious UX companies. Well, they coined a bit the term somehow, the guys there. And
yeah, Don Norman, I think,
yeah,
claims responsibility for the words user experience.
Yeah, so that brought me some curiosity to know how you blended these two worlds, and you in these 5-10 minutes you explained it very correctly from your perspective. So it was very interesting for me.
Well, I also had that the personal experience of trying to craft a website, a digital user experience for graffiti work. And that it was a very complex thing. We probably don't think about it so much now, but in 1994, there were a lot of decisions to be made. And that when I got a master's degree at Georgia Tech while I worked there, and that was where I started the website because that's where the internet was available. So we were on the backbone of the internet long before commercial access. But I had to so I wrote a paper about this particular thing, which was electronic museums and graffiti art, because I envisioned myself as making a digital museum of sorts, an archive. And so there were all these questions that I got from the art community. So as part of talking on campus about what I was trying to do and what I'd like to see for the graffiti artists, professors would ask hard questions like, how can you decontextualize this work and make it small? You know, in order to appreciate graffiti, it must be human scale, it must be on the wall, it must be in the sunshine. And here you are making tiny little rectangles out of it, and you're putting it in this 2D medium, and you're taking it out of the city. And so there's no sense of space, there's no sense of neighborhood, there's no sense of distance, there's no sense of approaching the work as a human of a particular size and having to look up at it, having to walk along it, let alone the experience of having a train roll by with a piece on it. And so there was all this pushback from academia toward what I was trying to do. And I said to them, why isn't graffiti art an American art form being celebrated in art history in the US? And they said, oh, it's ephemeral. we can't study it. It's just gone too fast. There's no repository of it. We can't even publish it. We don't understand it. And I said, gee, maybe I can fix that. You know, maybe I can make a big pile of it and nobody can ignore anymore. And then maybe people could write papers about it or something. But there were a lot of discussions about how to treat the work with respect and how to treat the work in such a way that it could be understood. And I believe that the web had to make terrible compromises in order to preserve and show the work, because they're not wrong. And many people since my effort have tried to create an experience on the web that was more resonant with the real experience in the world of graffiti art. And other people have tried to make it a more academic experience with more metadata and so on. But my concern was ephemerality too. I was afraid that people weren't documenting enough, and that that if people didn't capture it, that the work would be lost. It was constantly being lost. And I realized that the web offered graffiti art an opportunity that was probably more important than the compromises of the medium. And that was that the history of art is always the history of what people saved. So we don't have the history of art. We only have the history of what people saved, what was not destroyed, what was not thrown away. And so on the web or on the internet, another big tension was, and this was big between the institutional art and people like me, that there was concern about preciousness of art. So at the time in 1994, museums were not going to put anything on the web. They just weren't. I was working with one museum, Carlos Museum in Atlanta, that was brave enough to put some material on the web. But the reason they didn't want to do that was because they would necessarily be creating multiple copies of the work. And they felt that this would destroy the value of the original, and they felt it would destroy the value of going to the building. And they were terrified about that. But I felt opposite to that. I felt, in terms of graffiti art, I felt that that it was important that first of all, the fact that the photographs existed was a level of curation. So photographers decide what to take photos of. And so that's level one. Then the photographers decided which of those photos they would send to me. So that's another level of curation. Then I would decide, often with input from writers, which of those photos were good enough that they should be preserved on art crimes. And then the audience would decide which of those photos and pieces were interesting enough for them to take and save on their hard drives. And through this process of multiple levels of curation and multiple people saving things, graffiti art has a much better chance of surviving than many of these other kinds of art because of the multiple effect. And I often use the term dandelion seeds to describe this kind of proliferation and saving and multiplication of this essentially free art, this free public art that was being given away and given away and given away and given away multiple times over the years. So I think there's probably a lot to say about the user experience of graffiti online, but I wanted you to understand that there was quite a bit of struggle over that.
I imagine you are a long time on this. We have Jacob to make you a question. Jacob is here. Jacob, can you?
I think there was somebody before me. Was it Svenska Graffare? And then there was also Rita, who hasn't asked anything before, perhaps she can be before me, if you would.
Yes, you guys go ahead.
Who?
So
Rita.
Yeah, we were
Well,
asking.
yeah. I just my
It's
question
Juan.
because when I started writing in 1996, and I remember the first reference I had, it was our crimes on internet. When on internet was the first thing, and my question is basically, why is it any specific reason why haven't changed over the time the interface? So the interface is exactly the same that it was, as I remember, in the late 90s.
Well, this is actually about I don't know, I think there were 4 major iterations of the interface. And those mostly happened for technical reasons. As the web became more capable, I was able to change things. But and this is also the answer to why is it black? I felt strongly that the website itself should not have a design aesthetic of its own. It should be minimalist. It should be a nice background for the artwork, and that any kind of design I did on top of that would potentially be in conflict with that and would call attention to the design that I was doing. And I felt that I needed to remove myself as much as I possibly could from this. I was very uncomfortable being a curator of graffiti art. I still feel that I did it because I had the technical capability to do it and the opportunity to do it, but I wasn't a writer. I was a fine art painter, basically, a visual artist and a crafter. And so even though I felt like I had some ability to understand aesthetically what was good, especially after I had been carefully schooled by the graffiti community, I felt like it wasn't my job to do that, that it was really the writing community's job to do that, and that it would have been much better had a writer been, or a committee of writers been involved in choosing and showing. And so many times I tried to get graffiti writers to design a container for the website in order to improve this, because I know it was a source of constant angry email to me. But I also didn't have time to do it myself. I was completely focused on trying to get the backlog of photos online, which I never achieved. I was always about 10,000 photos behind. So much so that you don't see many of the 50,000 photos I took myself. I was so busy publishing other people's work. And so I dropped my art practice, and I worked part-time for 18 years for Nielsen Norman Group, so that I could run the business that kept the website online, and so that I could continue to publish.
Thank you for all your effort and for this amazing job, because it was at that time, I remember I come from a really small town in Spain, and at that time we didn't have access to many books or there was no information also to James Brigger and Henry Chalfont to give it to us, the opportunity to have something to take. So, and our crimes, it was a big thing for us, because it was somewhere that we could go and check from all around the world. And it was amazing. So thank you so much for that. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So Jacob, are you on?
Yeah, I'm on. Yes, I really enjoy this hearing all these stories and this discussion. So this was something for all 3 of you, but since I had the privilege of interviewing you, Susan, 10 years ago, you talked a lot about the responsibility being what I would, the term I used, and I would say that I am myself to some extent, and the three of you are all what I would say chroniclers, the ones who are documenting and contextualizing the history of graffiti.
Emphasis on the chronic.
Yeah, what you were doing were what you were talking about was your responsibility as a chronicler. That's my term, not your, but in relationship to the writers because of the interest of these activities from the police. I mean, the importance of, and you said so far, the police has not used my websites, not knocked my door. So this is something, because especially since you talked about Art Crimes as a museum, but the museum and also the library has this kind of double role of enabling, but also repressing. I mean, the library we have here in Sweden that document everything started out as a censoring. The king wanted to read everything that was written so he could know who he had to chop the heads of. So this, the museum or the library has this kind of like, it's a possible tool of repression. So I've just thought of, have you had any more? Have you, since we talked 10 years ago, have your website been used in criminal cases? And also that would go for Jim and Henry. Has your books turned up in such a forensic context?
This is something I worried about a lot, but I had very little control over. So, and it was terrifying. The police in the US are terrifying. They can do anything to you. As you can see now on the internet and thousands of videos from the last few weeks.
They're bad.
We got threats from police over time and also from vigilantes. There are anti-graffiti vigilantes that were very active when I first got online. In fact, they forced Art Crimes off the Georgia Tech servers by pressuring the president of the college and saying that we were conspiring to commit crimes and that we were encouraging crimes. And the idea there was that graffiti is a dangerous, contagious idea. And these vigilantes wanted to keep graffiti art off the internet because they were so afraid that it would become out of their control. And a lot of them were making their money buffing graffiti all day long in cities. It's amazing. So they were making millions of dollars collectively from tax dollars to paint walls gray. And meanwhile, they were harassing me on the internet and threatening to send people to my house. So I had to conceal my location. My face almost never appears on the internet. And I was very careful to try to do this as clandestinely as possible and to try to protect people who are emailing me. I had to encrypt all my email so that if my computer was seized, the identities of people wouldn't be exposed. I had to separate the email from the photos on my computer so they couldn't be put back together to the contributors. And I had to be very careful what kind of captions I put on those photos. And I had to take the metadata off the photos once photos became digital, because often they contain GPS locations and things like that that could destroy the location as a viable painting opportunity, or could attract police to watch that location and bust people in the future. So I had to resist everyone wanting maps to all the places to take photos. And I also instituted a rule that I would not publish any passenger trains from the US until they were 7 years old. And I did this to keep the FBI out of my living room. And I did this so that I wouldn't be creating a body of evidence that would put people in jail for years. So I felt like focusing on walls was the safest opportunity for everyone. And I published trains, passenger trains from outside the US. And still, I would get email sometimes 5, 6, 7 years after I published something from a train writer who would say, take my pictures off the internet today because I just got arrested, and they'll find them in a couple of days if you don't get them off there, if they don't have them already. So I had a lot of emergency takedowns of trains as people got arrested. In the US, Chicago was a hot spot for FBI taking down writing crews for writing on passenger trains. And in Seattle, the FBI took down a lot of freight crews for the same reason. So there was a lot of tension around painting trains that got national, very scary agencies involved. There was also another thing that was happening in the early internet. They used to call it the NSA line reader on Usenet News, which was a thing that happened on the internet before the web. The idea was that the National Security Agency, NSA in the US, was so all-knowing and all-powerful that they could read every word on the internet. We don't really think that's true. That wasn't true then. It's probably more true now, even though there are way too many words. But the idea was that every kind of communication, especially email, was in plain text, and that if they wanted to read it, they could. And so it was there was a lot of tension about what people wanted to tell me about their work and what I wanted them to say online about that, because I couldn't control the safety of their words in transit, and they didn't understand the risk. And so I used to joke a lot about how the NSA probably had to put me on a special list of people who could talk about bombing trains because so many people were talking about bombing trains in the graffiti writing sense, and yet this was a big problem in the terroristic sense. So yeah, lots of interesting things about that.
Susan, that's funny about the bombing. The only time I had any contact with the FBI in my life was when they called me up sometime in the 80s, and they said that we've had a credible threat against the transit system in New York, and we wanted to know if you've in the scuttlebutt if you've heard anything. And I laughed and I said, oh come on, bombing doesn't mean terrorism. And they said, I said, we've read your book, we know that. It's a serious threat. But nothing ever happened. They never returned to me. But I feel, Jim, you too, we lived in a charmed life pre-internet, because none of this happened to us. We lived in a time when there were undercover anti-graffiti squad who knew all the kids, and they'd show up at art shows. And anybody could talk to them, and so it was kind of an interesting cat and mouse game, but there was never any serious. For one thing, the crime in New York at the time was the courts were overwhelmed, and we heard anecdotes of people being brought before the judge, and the judge saying to the policeman, "Well, did you catch them in the act?" And the cop said, "Well, no, but I have a picture here which matches." And the judge said, Get out of here. You got too much to do to worry about this. So I don't know.
I used to publish a listing of all the graffiti art exhibitions that I could find, all the get-togethers and all the gallery shows and all the public mural paintings and so on, because I really wanted people to be able to find out about them, to participate in them, and to see that graffiti writers were able to enter those spaces like galleries and museums. And I wanted the public to understand that too. that this was a serious thing. And one of the things that happened in San Francisco and in New York in the 90s was that police started to get wind of these shows in advance also. And I don't know if they got that from me or if they got it from flyers on the poles, but as a result, they would lay in wait outside the gallery and wait for the artists to come in to hang the work, and then they would arrest them while they were hanging the work. And that meant that nobody who knew that would want me to advertise their event in advance. And they started announcing them the day after the opening when the artist was gone. And writers would go to their shows incognito and listen to people talk about the work and then sneak back out.
One thing about that, I was very sensitive about putting people's faces in spray can art. I remember asking Tina in Denmark, we had a nice photograph of her, and was she concerned if I put her picture in? And the answer was, I'll take the risk. It's more important to be in the book than it is to worry about being picked up. So everybody really kind of wanted to be in the book, and I don't think, other than maybe Cento in New York, who said to me, never take my picture from the front. But there was another thing going on in those days, and that was that the FBI was setting up storefronts, for example, in San Jose. And the gimmick was they invited writers to come in and sign their names. And the one that were chosen with the best calligraphy would get a trip to LA to be in a movie. Okay? So that's how far the FBI went to catch some of the local artists. And I remember warning so many of the artists to be very careful not to be caught in that trap.
Yeah, I had a strict no face policy. And there are only a couple of faces on art crimes, and those were a result of long discussions about risk, and only on the insistence of the artist over time would I allow them to take that risk. And usually I would only allow that if someone was working only legally, so that there would be no possibility they were going to get arrested for current illegal work. And most of them were older people, because I felt like the youngest writers were not able to assess their own personal risk or predict what their future work would be. And I didn't want them to compromise their identities in advance of doing illegal work later.
So thank you. I just to conclude this more heavy negative kind of posture of the thing, I'm very convinced that we are a minority, although it seems that graffiti practitioners are a lot of them, and it's a thing that there's a lot of influence already in the cultural generic idea of every country and so on. The anti-graffiti, it's much more strong in the sense that it's anchored to the economies of security enforcement. And they have, for instance, in Lisbon, we have this, let's say, image that we are open and everyone can come here and do a piece and so on and so forth. But this is made through like 1% or 2% of the total budget for graffiti purposes, and the rest of the 98% it's for cleaning. So it's a huge industry on surveillance and cleaning services and all that, and that industry is very strong in the sense that it doesn't have nothing to do with us, that we are only like soft cats here, like talking about culture and good intents, So they are very well organized. There's in the chat you can see there's even a tag conference about cleaning tags in Canada, And they now are entering in dialogue with the tag conference from Javier, that it's like studying tags since ever. And so these ways of looking to these interpretations of the subject, I think they are quite still very unbalanced. Let's say that the society, it's betting very much still on the cleaning and on the surveillance areas, and not so much on the culture side. We are a minority here. Okay.
I want to address that because I think it's a very, very important topic. Some of these buffers, people who eradicate graffiti for a living, are hate graffiti. Others like it, and they're just in it for the money. But a lot of people gave me pushback about art crimes. They said, why are you publishing this stuff? You're just going to create more of it. And don't you know that these cities are spending millions of dollars a year on graffiti? And I said, well, let's follow the money. Well, where's that money going? Where does it come from? It's tax dollars. It's being given to contractors who are being paid hundreds of dollars per tag so that they can create this damage figure that then can be produced in court. Hey, this person did 5 tags. That's 5 times $400. That's felony damages. So there were motivations like that to inflate the cost of eradicating graffiti, but also think what happens next. So somebody paints the wall illegally. Somebody comes along and paints the wall gray again. Somebody comes along and paints something illegally on the wall again. Somebody comes by and paints the wall gray again. Who makes the money? Paint companies. And the fact that the reason that the bill was so high is because of the back and forth. If they had decided to buff the town once a year, it would have been a lot cheaper. Or if they had decided that it didn't cost $400 per tag, it would have been a lot less newsworthy. So I think there's a lot of hypocrisy in the anti-graffiti community because they're raking in the money, but they're often saying very racist things about who's doing the writing and what that means about gangs and what that means about control. And I think that in the US in particular, we have this popular notion that it's okay to make a bunch of visual noise in public as long as you paid for it. So it's the tension is not between the police and the graffiti artists as much as it is the advertisers and the graffiti writers, because the advertisers want to occupy that same space and the writers are often writing over the advertising. And so I hear a lot of things from people. They say to me, that's not okay because nobody paid for it. And that's why I said in the chat very early that free is subversive. It's not just a notion in capitalist versus communist politics. It's this idea about who can own the visual space and about, so one woman encapsulated this very clearly for me. She said, that's not art. Art is what I pay for and I hang on my living room wall.
It's free.
Yeah.
Thank you for that, Susan.
Yeah. The thing I really, well, this goes back to many of the topics we already addressed here. And yeah, we are running a bit off time already, and I don't want to push over, but I really think that this is one of the big issues still to solve. It was one of the purposes that made me organize these conferences and academic connection with these perspectives on graffiti, because I really believe that if we go against these security-wise and cleaning services structures with numbers that, you know, influence that positively the cultural aspects of graffiti that can influence positively and can be overthrown this other logic. Somehow, if we academically try to explain these rationally to some people, not all, because some of them, they just don't want to know, maybe we can gain some force here. And one thing, it's true, lots of projects of graffiti, street art, urban art, whatever, they gain, well, the structure is supported by this kind of funding, the funding for cleaning, the funding from, you know, for trying to put people not doing this. And this raises lots of other questions, of course, but at the same time, maybe we can gain more terrain here, because it's, in terms of society, I really believe that if we decide all collectively, rationally, in a certain sense, we can, the attitude towards urban space with graffiti, street art, or other forms of creation, more spontaneous creation, can be a solution for what we are facing in the future, in the sense that we can solve our own, you know, well-being in the urban space. But this is a kind of a not supported vision on any academic thing, but it's one of the reasons why I've made the conference and why we are all here for 3 days now and in the last moment. So take this comment as almost a conclusion. I don't know if someone else wants to join the conversation. I know that Svenska wanted also to make some questions regarding the last panel. So please, Svenska, yeah, you can.
Cheers. Yeah, important words there. And before I do this concluding question, I want to thank you for setting it up and everyone who's been speaking that I've caught. Great Saturday night in my book, best €5 I ever spent. But I wanted to ask in closing what you three guys in this last panel are working on at the moment, if anything, starting with James, perhaps. Current projects, James?
For me,
Yes.
probably 20 years ago, I should have started to worry about where I was going to archive my enormous documentation of murals and street art. But here I am at 92, faced with that problem. Henry and all of us, I think, are faced with that. If anybody has any ideas, I don't want to give it away. I do want to be reimbursed for it. But if anybody has any suggestions, I have a remarkable documentation of the art form going back to the very earliest days. I'd be pleased to hear from you. And I would also be very glad, as I said before, somebody asked if they could ask questions about a film for which they're making stories. By all means, contact me at jprigoff12@comcast.net. So for the moment, that's what I'm doing. I'm just kind of sequestered at home. I'm not doing a lot of traveling to photograph. I'm leaving that to really those that are coming along and following. And I'm just grateful to be part of this symposium. I think it's wonderful that you're all so interested and so knowledgeable. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. That was great. Thank you. I know, Henry, what you'll be doing.
Archiving is one of the things. You know, the last couple of years, I've had two big exhibits, which were the one in Madrid and then one in the Bronx, which galvanized me to start to organize my stuff. And I've had a lot of help, first from Suso 33 in Madrid, who designed that show and the Bronx show the next year. Really made me focus and bring the material together, and I'm only partway there. Then I have a friend in Mexico who is archiving the work that I did, the photo work that I did, which was related to graffiti and the emergence of hip hop, with my connection to the breakdancing and all of that. And I was often invited. I was not originally a photographer, and it's been a struggle to actually try to be able to make a good picture. And so when I was doing this, I was invited to take pictures of park jams and people painting trains and walls and just hanging out, and accumulated quite a collection. And so I want to make one more book, and it will be about those pictures. It will be those pictures and some commentary about them and their meaning. Otherwise, I am trying to enjoy myself. I've gotten quite involved with music. I play an instrument from Veracruz State in Mexico called the jarana, and I play it with a bunch of musicians who are playing son jarocho, and it's basically Afro-Mexican music. So it's Caribbean, and it emerges from the same, it's the slave trade and the conquest of Mexico, and so it's a combination of indigenous music, Afrocentric music, and Baroque music from Europe, from Italy and Spain. So, but it's fun to play. And
I want to hear some of that.
Yeah, it's around. Where are you? Are you in San Francisco still?
No, I fled during the pandemic, and now I am living in Oregon again.
Yeah. Well, it's growing because there's such a large presence of people from both Veracruz and Guerrero and Chiapas in the United States now, and they bring their culture with them, and they gather to play all the time, and it's a wonderful community kind of music to play, where everybody comes out, and the rhyming couplets evolve constantly with new work to comment on the life which is going on now. So it's a very exciting thing to be a part of. I'm not going to make a documentary about it. I'm just going to enjoy it, because I'm while not nearly as venerable and aged as Jim is, I'm only 80. Still in all, I think it's time to get a little bit more relaxed about life.
I
Good
hear
time.
that. Yeah, so I guess I'm the youngster.
Yeah.
I'm 60 something.
Wow.
And I am, so I'm hoping to draw to a conclusion my working for other people for money stage of my life. Currently, I work for a company that is producing smart high-tech products of various sorts in San Francisco. And you can see the environment that I'm speaking to you from. This is our new product, which was announced this week. It's called which is MMHMM. So, maybe that will change. I don't know. It's what the CEO called it. But the idea is to have an online video aesthetic environment, one in which you can have a better, more professional appearance. Clearly, I'm not exemplifying that today, but you have control over where you put yourself. You can add a frame to put your slides in. You can have a television-like setting and change your backgrounds. Right now I'm showing a background that is a photo from China and work by Faith 47. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. She's a South African artist now living in Los Angeles who is a graffiti writer who does this sort of aesthetic. thing now. And I'm mentioning this because we have opportunities for artists in this new product. If anybody is interested in submitting some work for consideration, the product team will be sharing revenues with artists who help populate the tool with wallpapers and so on that people can use online. And right now it works with a few different things. Zoom is its major compatibility, but it will be compatible. It's already compatible with Google Meet and Google Teams on Mac platforms, and it's going to be cross-platform very as soon as we can make it cross-platform. So that aside, that's what I'm doing professionally right now. I hope that I'll retire in another year or two. And for art crimes, as you know, I've stopped adding material to it, at least at present. And that's largely because I had to take a full-time job. And I had to move back to San Francisco, and that meant a 2-hour commute a day and so on. So my time was completely eaten up that I had been using to do art crimes in. But I also felt like I had reached a lot of my goals with art crimes, that I had succeeded in changing the conversation about graffiti art. I had succeeded in getting a lot of other people in the world, millions of other people perhaps, to help document and crowdsource. I had succeeded in encouraging writers to make their own presentations of their own art so they could have their own conversations directly with their audiences. Now that Instagram exists, art crimes is less necessary in terms of publishing what happened last night kind of stuff. And I thought to myself, well, gee, this is largely a 1990s code base on this. I don't know how many of you know anything about websites, but there's no database there. There's no content management system. I can't make a change that proliferates from one page to another because each page is its own object. It's its own individual code, and there's no really anything that transfers across them. And there are 17,000 pages according to the developers I'm working with. So it has some entropy there, some inertia. And what I had hoped was that now that these technologies exist, that I could fundraise and hire a team of programmers to transform this into a modern code base and a modern system so that those kind of systemic changes could happen. And more important, that it could become a multi-user curation environment so that I could give the art crimes project to the graffiti community and they could carry it on without having to depend on me. This is a vision that hasn't been realized, although I have succeeded in attracting an open source team of programmers who says they would like to do this. What they did do is they moved it into GitHub. I mean, not GitHub, Git, which is a version control system, which also helped safeguard it from hackers knocking it offline. And they helped regulate the code base and make it consistent and helped standardize some of the things that weren't standardized. And they helped archive it. So it's now properly archived at the Internet Archive. It's not live there, but it could be anytime that any need arises for it to be replicated there live. It's saved there. It's also saved in a German graffiti archive, and it's also saved on a server in Poland that has been one of our mirrors the whole time. it's always been necessary for there to be multiple copies of Art Crime so that it became uninteresting to confiscate it and knock it off the net. So now there are even more copies of it, and I feel very comfortable that it will survive me as a result. So that was the most important thing for me, is to preserve the first 20 years of work as an artistic object, a historical record of what happened on the web in the early days with graffiti. And the next step, if it occurs, will be to transform that container and then go on with a broader, more culturally appropriate curation team. Besides that, I've got my archives. I haven't had a chance to mess with those. I've got a lot of film negatives. I need to do something besides just file. I need to scan them. And I have a lot of collected artwork and collected memorabilia that should probably be taken care of in a somewhat better way. I did manage to frame almost all of the artwork that I've collected, and it's all in boxes in my living room. So I need to figure out how to get that back up on the walls and properly document that.
Okay, lots to do.
Yeah.
Peter Bengtson wants to say some final words. I don't know if somebody else also wants to say something in final, but Peter wants, certainly. Go, Peter.
Right. So can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. So if we had been in Lisbon physically, this would be around the time that I would get on stage or crash the stage after Pedro had said his final words. First thing I want to do is just reassure everyone that both Javier and I are perfectly fine. So don't worry about the discussion that we had previously. But that's not really what I wanted to say. What I wanted to say is that this is the 7th year running that this conference occurs, and this is obviously quite an achievement. And I just wanted to acknowledge, as Andrea has said a couple of times, this really feels like a second family. I've said this before at the conference, but I wanted to say it again this year because each year it becomes more true, really. A lot of us have met many times, and it's so nice to see familiar faces. It's also so nice to see new people joining. And when I say new, I don't necessarily mean young scholars. I mean people who are new to this particular context. So I just wanted to, as people are also doing in the comments, just wanted to thank Pedro once again for pulling this off, especially during these difficult circumstances. Of course, the context of the conference this year is significantly different from previous iterations of the conference. Usually, there's a social aspect which is sadly missing this year. We will go out when we're in Lisbon. We will go out. The conversations will continue long after the formal panels have ended, and that would also be the case tonight. But unfortunately, we're not able to do this. But hopefully we'll be able to meet in person again in Lisbon next year, assuming that Pedro will once again take on the responsibility and the task of arranging this. So thank you, Pedro, once again.
You're welcome. You're welcome. I will try, of course, always, and it's good. Maybe we can do a grand finale and mute all and try to put all the videos so to see if this crashes or not.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much, Pedro.
Bye. Thank you for all, and hope you enjoyed. I've saved some parts I will share, and I will also save the chat, and I will share the content. So keep up, and see you soon. Okay.
Bye.
Well,
Thank you.
Bye.
Killed it.
So exciting to see you. Thank you.
Drink some wine now. And stuff.
Super Bowl.
Yeah. Everyone be
whatever.
safe. Be safe.
Thank you, Henry and Susan, also for your wonderful.
Don't come to the US for a while.
Yeah,
Sorry.
that's not, yeah.
We can't come to you either.
No,
We're not
Yeah,
allowed.
it's
we're allowed to go to Mexico and the Balkans, and that's it right now. And that's
Right.
probably short-lived. All right.
keep safe. That's the thing also.
Right.
Well, stay well.
Bye now.
Bye bye.